Let's see if this multi-streaming thing works. Probably the wrong time to test this out, but you gotta learn somehow. Okay, I see that I'm live on YouTube, and I can see myself on Twitch. And if I talk in the chat, does that get bumped over to YouTube? I guess I don't care that much. Yep, looked like it worked. That's it's amazing when things work on the first try. All right. Oh man. Hello, Gooby the Stealth. Thanks for tuning in. While other people pour in here. Oh, that's right. I forgot about my Streamlabs. Hey, Devil. Hey, man, that's not nice. I think you can do better. You haven't seen heads nor tails of me for 2 years, and that's how you treat me. So this is going to be a learning process for me. I haven't done this in a while, but I'm going to shake off the rust and try and get into a groove. I really don't have a ton of time here to kill, but I'll do my best to interact with you guys as time permits. I'm going to also hope that my internet holds up. I just worked to get it all set up so that it'll hopefully be as stable as I can possibly get it. Good Lord, I didn't expect so many people this fast. How's Ollie? He's good. Sometimes he comes in here and jams on that keyboard so that he can... I'm used to my camera being up here. I gotta get used to looking over there. He likes to jam on that keyboard over there and do work with me. But yeah, he's napping right now, like Chelsea said. So anyway, here's what we're gonna do. I don't know how this is gonna look like a week or 2 weeks from now. I'm just gonna figure it out as I go. But here's where I'm at. I've been learning games programming for about 9-10 months now, maybe closing in on a year. I don't even remember exactly when I started. I started messing with a bunch of different tools, and I was just trying to figure out, okay, how do I want to make games? Because there's a lot of different ways you can make games. I'm a programmer at heart, so that's just kind of how I prefer to try and work on a game. I don't like sitting and trying to figure out how this fancy UI works with like Unreal, for instance. I did try Unreal for a couple months off and on over the years. I had always dabbled in games programming or game development, I guess you would say, but I just never really took it seriously. It was something that I always wanted to do, but now I'm getting serious about it. So I try all these different tools. Eventually I find something called the Zig programming language. And why is Siri trying to talk to me? Shut up. Shut the hell up. So I find the Zig programming language. It's a newer programming language that is trying to be a better C or a better C++. And I went back to this old series that I discovered a long time ago when I first started learning how to code, called Handmade Hero. When I discovered that series, I had just met Chelsea, or maybe I met Chelsea just a little bit after that series. And basically what it is it's this guy, Casey Muratori, who had been in game development for 2+ decades at that point. So he wanted to show how to make a game completely from scratch, which is a whole lot more my style. I want to learn how everything works. That's just how my brain works. And so I started following that series, but I got overtaken by events and I was never able to revisit it until this past year. And instead of writing it in a combination of C and C++ like Casey does, I wanted to try it in a different language because I was just looking for a new language to experiment with. I tried Rust is another really popular one that I dabbled with a little bit, but Zig stuck a little bit more. And so I worked through a bunch of Casey's Handmade Hero series over the course of this entire year. And I'll go ahead and so something that just happened, I think. He took down the website for Handmade Hero, and he put this disclaimer here saying that the series is on hiatus. So at the time, there was maybe when I first discovered this series, he was maybe I gotta get a better follow notification. Thank you to all of you who are following right now. I really appreciate it. When I discovered this series, he was only like 100 to 200 days in. Now at this point, there's like 600 plus episodes, and basically the series kept going long after I first discovered it, and it got to a point a couple years ago where I think the creator, he effectively felt like it had run its course almost, or he wasn't sure which direction to take it in. He got to this point where he's like, I've done all this stuff, but I don't really have a game in mind. And he'll say it all the time. He'll over and over, he'll repeat, I'm not a game designer. That's not really my forte. I'm a programmer. I'm an engine programmer. That's what I do. And I think that him not being a designer is ultimately what made him feel like he wanted to, take a break from it and go on this hiatus. But this makes it official right here. So, you can follow this series from the start, and it'll teach you a whole bunch of different things about programming. Whether you're really experienced or not, I expect you would learn something from watching this series of his. But it says down here, we hope to have more information in the near future about whether we will resume the series or replace it with a newly designed one that better provides the educational benefits people end up wanting. And basically, he was just on a podcast recently, the creator of this series, and he said, he wishes that he had figured out how to distill the most important aspects of the series into a smaller set of episodes that would be more easily digestible, because not everybody's going to be willing to sit through 600 days worth of games programming content, right? Well, I'm an insane person, and so I am willing to do that and sit through 600 days of games programming content, because there's just so much to learn, and I like looking at him tackle all these different things. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm actually going to follow his series. I'm going to try to. I don't know if this format is going to work all that well on stream, to be honest with you. We're going to see how it goes. But I'm going to follow it as best I can. I did write him an email asking essentially for his permission, because this is a really weird thing. Tons and tons of people have learned from this series, but it is a free thing. And the idea of restreaming it, I wasn't sure how he would feel about it. So I wrote asking like, hey, would you mind if I did this? And I didn't get a response. Now, I'm not taking silence as consent necessarily, but if he finds out that I'm doing this and he doesn't like it and he doesn't want me to do it, then he can tell me so and I'll stop doing it. I don't have a problem with that. But until that happens, I don't know. I'm really excited to go through the process of redoing this series, because I did it with Zig. I mentioned Zig a few minutes ago. Well, another language that caught my eye when I was looking at new programming languages was Odin, and I was too invested in Zig at the time to give it a real shot. And then like a month ago, I went ahead and tried it out, and it's solving a lot of the issues that I felt I was having with Zig. I guess I could bring up the Zig documentation too. So these two languages are the ones I've been learning the past 10 months. I spent a long time learning Zig, and I got like 120 days into this series before I just decided to give Odin a shot. And then now Odin is sticking quite a bit, so that's what I'm going to be working on. But if you are at all interested in this series, Handmade Hero, even though he's taken down the website, you follow this link at the website, and I'll actually just put this in the chat. Hey everybody that's pouring in, I'll just say hi real quick. Hey John, Garcon, long time no see. Hey Turtles, Faith, good. Many have come. This is like that scene in the Lord of the Rings when the Ents all gather in the forest, and they're like, and Treebeard is like, good, many have come. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. So, did I actually drop that link in? There we go. Yeah, so if you follow that link and you're interested at all in this, you can actually pay for the source code to the series, and it comes with all the art assets and everything. That's what I've done. So I'm going to obviously be restreaming his series as I work through it, but I'm going to be translating it into the Odin programming language. And if you're not familiar with programming at all, it's going to look like a lot of nonsense, and it might hurt your eyes. But I don't know, maybe you'll find it interesting, maybe not. I know I saw some people saying that in the years since they since they watched me and they've moved on with their own lives, that some of them had gotten into game design, which is pretty cool. Hopefully you'll help me at some point. I'm not at a point where I'm ready to even think about trying to design a game. I have some ideas, I have some concepts, some themes that I want to play around with, but I have nothing concrete. Nothing so concrete as an actual game design that I want to start drilling down on and trying to perfect. But you got to start somewhere. So anyway, that's the whole premise here. And the way this is going to work out, how am I doing for time? I'm doing okay. What is going on with this? Computer forensics. Hold on. I want to read this. Computer forensics, internet marketing and e-commerce, website, project management, getting into topics like sickle. Was there a precursor to this? What am I missing? Somebody's speaking my language. Okay. So the format is going to look like this. I have my editor right here. You'll watch me code there. And over here, I'll have Casey. Generally speaking, he'll be... He does this thing. He showed up in a bunch of different programming YouTube channels. He'll go on podcasts if people ask him. There's a pretty big programming channel called the Primogen, where he sat in and talked to the host of that channel, Primogen, and they've gone back and forth about a bunch of different industry-related stuff, CPU architecture, all these things that are really interesting to learn about. But one thing that Casey has become famous for is his whiteboard, and this he's like, it's like some kind of more sophisticated Microsoft Paint. This is like the precursor to that whiteboard that he's now like renowned for, I guess. He did a really controversial video a few years back where he got on the whiteboard and he said this thing that's really common in my industry called I gotta silence that one too. Thank you to whoever just subbed. I appreciate it. But I can't have that. Look, I have to change that sound. I can't have that popping off when I'm trying to, stay in a zone. So what I might do, I don't know, hopefully I can mute it somehow. I silenced it, but I don't know if that's, or I didn't silence it, I hit it, but I don't know. In fact, we just heard it, so I know that it's making sounds. How do I stop that? Damn it. You guys, how dare you? How do I turn off? I'm gonna have to look this up. You're getting me off track. Look, the point is, the whiteboard is kind of this funny thing that has evolved over time. It was, again, started off as this primitive, more sophisticated Microsoft Paint, and now he's on like an actual whiteboard, and he's making all these controversial points, and it's getting a lot of people mad, but I love to see it. I love a little bit of controversy. Oh, damn it. I gotta turn this off. I gotta get started. I don't have time. But thank you, Nutella, Big Boy, Big Boy, Corad. Thank you all for the subs. I'm sorry that I don't really have time to go through the chat. I'm hoping, I can make time to do more Hangout streams, but the whole point of these streams is that I need to get better. I need to learn things, okay? I can't be, not that I can't learn things from you. And if you have something relevant to what I'm streaming that you want to contribute, then I would really appreciate it. I'm definitely going to get stuck, and there'll be moments like that where we can, chill back and you can make fun of me for being stuck. But anyway, how do I turn this sound off? How do I do it? I can type right, turn off Streamlabs sounds. Alerts. Go to the Slobs dashboard. I'm not even logged in, am I? Thank you for the follow, whoever that was. Log in with Twitch. I tried to think of everything beforehand, but clearly I did not think of everything. I didn't think about you guys spamming me with those sweet, sweet subs. Alert box. Sound. Here we go. All right. If I hear it again, then shame on you for trying to test it and interrupt me again. But hopefully what I did just fixed it. You've barely programmed since college. I thought that's what you did for a living, Devil. Derby said, I'll try my best to help out with anything, but I've been much more leaning into level and system design, so my general code is falling behind. That's fine. I think part of this is not just... Part of the point of what I want this stream to be about is not just for programming. I think it's about anything gaming related. That's where I come from. That's where I started. But programming is just the niche that I've kind of carved out for myself. Another thing that I'll mention here is that with Casey right above me, it might block off some code. But where the hell am I pointing? It might block off some of the code in my editor. I don't know that that really matters. Nobody's watching me do this so that they can program it in Odin. There will be a repo where you can go and look at this code if you're so inclined. But anyway, there's not going to be much coding today, actually, because if I can figure out... Here we go. So on this other screen, there's not going to be much code today because on this episode I'm at. So I kind of cheated a little bit. You're going to make me delete it? Why is it happening? But thank you for that sub. I do appreciate it. I don't appreciate that I wasn't smart enough to shut off my notifications before I started this stream. No sounds anymore. Yeah, no, there was sound. Why can't I figure this out? This is embarrassing. Wait a minute. Yeah, isn't it? It should just be alerts, right? Control audio via OBS. Is that it? Damn it, I need to just get rid of this. This is not what I want to be seeing. Bad, bad. Thanks, Latias. Good to hear from you. So why isn't that working? I've got... Oh, I see. I had... Okay, I think I got it now. I think I got it now. Wait a minute. Resubs. Why can't I just turn off the audio? It wants me to... I want to turn off the audio for everything. So I have to go into all of these individual widgets and turn them all off, I guess. I just want to be able to toggle the sound on and off. I can't be trying to get something done, trying to focus, and hear myself screaming in my own ear. Okay. Well, let you guys test that again, I guess, when the time comes. Damn it. There's no time for this. I guess I could actually... Can't I test it myself? I'm sorry. I need to make sure this is resolved. I can't... I can't let this go. Here we go. Okay, it tested. What the fuck? Why did Windows feel the need to tell me that it was reconnecting? Did the stream die? It did die. That was weird. Okay, well, this is probably a good thing. It still says it's the same stream, so I guess that's nice. Yeah. I don't even know. Okay, but yeah, so this is a good point to really get started here. So, again, what I was trying to say before Windows rudely interrupted I need to turn Windows notifications off. Everything's got to fucking notify me. Sorry. I'm trying not to swear so much. Not because I think, you know, it's bad for me, but I just can't have my kids hearing me swear all the time. And then I have to answer questions from grandparents when they're like, why does Oliver know that word? Okay, so thanks to all of you who have subbed, not just here on Twitch or followed, but also those of you subbing on the new YouTube channel. This VOD will live permanently, if all goes well, on the YouTube channel. But, so here's the deal. Here's what I was saying. So I kind of cheated a little bit, and I'm actually 26, well, technically 25 days. I'm starting the 26th day today of Handmade Hero. The first 25 days of Handmade Hero, all Casey does is he builds this platform layer, which gives him the ability to draw windows and output sound with the operating system. And he's doing it with Windows, and if that sounds like gibberish to you, that's fine. Don't worry about it. It'll, if you watch enough of this happen, eventually you just get a sense for what the heck is going on. But all is the internet doing this right now? I don't understand. Is it because I'm playing the game? Does playing the game kill my stream? This is great. Maybe it's because I'm trying to play all of these feeds. I don't even... But it was working fine for so long. It's telling me I'm dropping 50% of my frames. Is that really what's happening right now? I can see myself just fine. I don't get it. Why is Stream Elements saying my old channel name is live? That's great. I gotta fix that. Yeah, I gotta... How do I shut Stream Elements up? Why are you even here? I don't want you. Whatever. It looks fine. Okay. I don't know. I tested this several times. It's still telling me that I'm dropping a bunch of frames. I don't understand why the internet always has to do this to me. When I was getting the modem installed in this room last week, the tech was saying that we might get fiber here someday. That day could be years from now for all it matters, but I'm holding out hope that that happens someday and I can have more stable internet. It's either that or I gotta move, you know, to a different state in a different county or something, which probably isn't gonna happen. So we gotta deal with what we've got. Okay, so I'm just gonna, let's see, if I build and run the game again, is that gonna crash my internet? Does running a game crash my internet? It looks fine. Okay. I'm just gonna hope that this was a fluke. I still don't understand. OBS still telling me I'm dropping 60% frames, but it looks fine, so what the hell do I know? So anyway, yeah, this is the game we have so far. I can scroll around, and Casey just kind of shows how to do all of this in those first 25 days of Handmade Hero. I can jump. That's what this is, but I'm stuck. This controller, actually, is this gonna work? No, this controller is hooked up to my laptop. But if I had my controller plugged in, I'll plug it in next time. Gotta wait for it to turn off now. Thank you. It'll control this little white box, and then you can move around on the screen. The other thing I can do is I can loop the game, like so. And now, no hands. And then we've got, you know, live hot code reloading and looped live code editing. So I could come in here and I could change the... that's actually not going to happen unless I run it over here. I could come in here and I could change the color back here, for instance, which is kind of neat. And so while it's looping, I can come in here, rebuild the game. If I rebuild it properly, why isn't that working? Did I not have that command set up right? I must not have it set up right. Well, I do not have time to figure out why that isn't working. I guess what I can do is this. I'm determined to show that this actually works now, so I don't look like a fool. Can I just... Oh, it's because I don't have a build. Of course. Okay. Wait, no. Yes. Okay, that is why. I did not... Here's why it didn't work. I had to use my brain. I actually don't know. Let me just see something really quick. I'm going to see if I can get this build game batch file. And hopefully you can actually see this, and my internet isn't dying right now. It looks okay. I just have to go back and check, because now I feel like everything's going to explode every 5 minutes again. So let's build game.bat, and I'm going to come in here. I don't think I need any of this other stuff up here. Oh, I want to echo off. I want to make that build directory if it doesn't already exist, and I want to build the game, but I need these flags to work. Okay. And now I'm going to have to quit my editor, restart it, and that works. Okay, now I can show the hot code reloading. This is like the coolest part. Oh, now it's the color that I... Okay, I'll change it back to the other color. That's what I'll do. I feel so scatterbrained. I'm not used to having to talk while I do this. There we go. Did that work? Oh, interesting. Shell returned a bad thing. So it's probably worth pointing out at this point that this whole time I've been working on this platform layer with the Odin programming language. I've been writing it all on my MacBook. This is the first time I've messed with it on Windows, and of course I did not think far enough ahead. And so it's giving me some kind of error that... Let's see here. Where am I? It's giving me an error that it can't build the game. What did I do? And I don't know why it is. And this little error code, can you see that? Okay, you can. I don't know what that means, so I need to like... Let's try looking at the batch file. Let's try just running this, maybe. Trying to get too fancy. See, the problem is maybe I just shouldn't use all these build flags here. I'm so behind schedule now, it's not even funny. That didn't work. I don't know why that's not working. Well, I don't have time to figure this out now. I was hoping it would be really easy to deal with, but clearly I'm missing something really stupid. That's okay. So here's what we're going to do. I'll figure that out, and I'll hopefully be able to show off that tomorrow, because today, like I was saying, so he does the platform layer for those first 25 days, and jumping into day 26, because this is the part I wanted to get to, because he actually starts talking about the game code itself. And so I figured also I wanted to prove that I could get to this point with this other programming language that I had never tried before. So far it's going great, but let me catch up with the chat a little bit here. Is there a specific game you're trying to make, or just generally getting the hang of designing a game? So I'm specifically not designing a game, or at least that's not a goal here at all. I just want to learn how to build the components, the engine components that you would need for like a game engine, if that makes sense. And yeah, it kind of looks like the stream restarted itself again. I don't know what that's about. It looks fine over here. Yeah, I don't understand why this happened. I wonder. Yeah, this is a true programming stream. We are just trying to get the stream to stream. That's hard enough as it is. But yeah, so designing a game, it's not that I don't want to get to that point. It's just that's not the thing that I'm most concerned about at this point in time. Yeah, I see that it restarted 4 minutes ago. No graphics library. That is correct. We're basically going to build, if there's a graphics library here, we're going to build it ourselves over time. Hopefully, if my stream will actually let me. I don't want to have to like pre-record this stuff either, because I think the whole point is that I want to be able to talk with you in the chat about how this is going on the fly. So I don't know. Like I said, this is going to be rough as I kind of get situated and get it figured out how to do this. You know, I've never had to try to stream programming before. It became natural enough after playing games and talking about it for long enough, but this is a different thing altogether. And you'll hear Casey as well comment on this sort of thing all the time, that he'll make mistakes that he would never otherwise make if he wasn't streaming. Like whatever is stopping me from getting this thing to build, it's probably something really simple, but I just don't have the time to troubleshoot that while I'm streaming, unfortunately. So let me get rid of all these. I've got all these tabs open now that I don't want. I don't know why that didn't work. I goofed. So yeah, we'll switch over here and I'll just let Casey take some of the pressure off of me. Already feels like I'm screwing up so much. And I'll try and observe the chat while I listen to him. And if an interesting conversation happens, we'll have it.
Start recording.
Oh, and also, if he's just way too loud, or you can't hear me, or conversely, you can't hear him, just let me know. What the fuck? I just want to do my stream. I honestly can't believe this. I tested my internet like 3 times over the last week, and it worked really well every time. I'm gonna have to. There actually is fiber in the city where I live, but I live in an old house, and so there's no chance of getting it in here unless the provider decides that they want to put in that infrastructure work. So looks like it's back now. I'll just try and stop the stream when I notice that, well, Windows is going to let me know, right? But ding, it's just going to keep on barking at me every single time. It looks like the stream is still turning into one big video on YouTube, which is what I wanted. I'm glad I decided to try the multi-stream thing. I do see that some of you are watching on YouTube. Thank you for those of you who are watching on YouTube. Just thank all of you for showing up. This is awesome. Just tell them it's the class JTM and they'll do it. Yeah, I mean, I wish I had that power. I don't think, like, who's the biggest streamer in the world right now? Like a Shroud or a I don't even. That's like the only name that I know of. There's a bunch I know. If you mentioned them, I would remember. But I don't think even if those guys told, maybe if they had a relationship with the city, they could be like, hey, I have all this cash, I'll donate to your campaign, but you get fiber in my neighborhood. Or maybe they would probably have the cash, actually, now that I think about it, to just build the infrastructure themselves. They'll just hire a contractor to install the fiber. What am I thinking? That makes, but then again, yeah, I don't know. I also tried considering Starlink, but when I was looking into people's experiences with Starlink and streaming, it was never, I never saw like a really positive affirmation of streaming with Starlink, but I might try. I might try something like that at some point if this is just what I'm gonna have to expect from my internet. iShowSpeed and Casey Nat are the biggest. Maybe XQC. I don't know who those are. Last time I checked, it was Smosh. That's good. All right. Sorry about that. Finally, again, if the internet will just quit being a little bitch, we can let Casey do his thing.
What is really, I guess,
Oh, and in case you missed it, because my internet did die right as I started playing it again, if he's too loud or if I'm too loud, please let me know. I did test it. That was one thing I did remember to test before starting the stream.
some sense, the very first day of Handmade... Start recording. Okay, everyone, hello and welcome to what is really, I guess, in some sense, the very first day of Handmade Hero programming, where we're actually going to be talking about programming the actual game. Because obviously we had to spend what I guess is about 25, I guess there's maybe a little more than that, but something like 26, 27 hours writing ourselves a prototyping layer that we could use on Win32, which we have mostly done. I mean, there's plenty of things that I would probably, if I was programming full time in my real life, I would clean up a ton of stuff probably still in the prototyping layer, even though it is just a prototyping layer. But for the moment, it's plenty good for our purposes, and since I know we will be going back there and doing a real, like, serious pass on it later when we go to make a fully shippable Win32 layer, I figured I don't really want to belabor the point, you know, cleaning up stuff in the platform layer at this point. Specifically the audio, obviously, we kind of, it wants a couple more days of, like, solid work to, like, nail everything down, and also to kind of maybe use on platforms where core audio exists and stuff like that, you know, to use it, because the direct sound latency was pretty darn high, and I'd be interested to know if we could get a lower latency outputs, that sort of stuff.
So he's talking about audio being a pain in the butt, and Chelsea knows that was my biggest pain point in trying to originally, back when I was writing and following this series, writing code following the series in the Zig programming language, I had an audio bug that took me weeks to solve, and I was so upset the whole time. I was like, why do I suck so bad that I can't figure out where this popping sound is coming from? And he goes through it multiple days in those first 25. I think it's probably like there's 5 days in total where dealing with like audio kind of being a pain in the butt is a thing. And he eventually discovers that he can't get the audio to be not latent. Like no matter what he does, it's like a full frame, a full few frames behind, or maybe even like a whole second behind. And I remember reading posts, because there was a whole Handmade Hero forum, which I think might be gone now that the website is gone. But on this forum, there were people writing about how Direct Sound, the API that he's using, wrapped by a different API, a new Windows Sound API, and just because of that evolution of the Windows operating system, it was kind of forced into being latent if you use Direct Sound, but if you use the updated API, it's faster. So that's why why in the hell is this happening? It pops out and then it reconnects over and over again. This is like the 6th time. I can't believe it, dude. Almost 100 subs on YouTube. Thank you so much. We'll see if this internet issue is a fluke or if there's something else I can do to... I guess it could be on Restream's end, because I am doing... But no, that doesn't make sense. Well, maybe it does. Because I didn't do a long test through Restream, which is this multi-stream platform. I'm sure if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. But I wonder if I just need to change the server or something, I would have trusted them to figure it out. But my internet doesn't seem down. Like, it doesn't seem like it's my internet. It seems like Restream is dropping out, trying to push the stream out to both YouTube and Twitch. So I don't really know what to do about that. Worst case scenario, I'll probably have to stop dual streaming to YouTube and then just save the recording on my end and then re-upload it later. But anyway.
But for the most part, I mean, we've got a pretty solid prototyping layer that we can easily use to make the game. It's just not the kind of thing you would ever ship to end users because, again, it's for prototyping. So we haven't done the work necessary to make a really shippable Win32 platform layer, and we'll be looking at that in a bit. But for the next couple months, what we're going to be doing is actually making the game, which is kind of the most interesting part of the programming, I think, almost always, because playing around with platforms sometimes can be fun, but a lot of times it's just drudge work of trying to basically figure out exactly how to get something that you know is possible to happen on the platform, and you're kind of spending a lot of your time working around or experimenting with some stuff that some other programmer wrote who might not have been any good and isn't very well documented and blah, blah, blah. And so that's a lot less satisfying. It's also it's harder for me, too, to sort of do these streams because these are educational streams, and when I am explaining something that we wrote entirely ourselves, I can do a much better job of explaining to you why everything works the way it does, whereas obviously when we're doing a Win32 platform layer or a Linux platform layer or a Mac platform layer, I wasn't the guy who wrote the operating system. So when we get to a certain point, wherever that point is in, sort of, when we go down the levels of what's happening in, in the code, there's a certain point at which, I have to just go, and we don't know. We call Windows, and this seems to be what it does, so that's what it does, right? And that's just kind of unsatisfying. So I guess that's just a very long-winded way of saying.
This is a total aside, but I don't know if it's like the OCD part of me, but whenever he takes a gulp of his drink, I love the guy to death for what he's done. There's a lot of people who have learned to code from his streams, but every single time he takes a swig of that drink, I'm going to try and be conscious of it so you're not hearing both him and me do it in your ear all the time. But, yeah.
Now we are finally getting to the point where we will know everything that happens because we have put ourselves in a position to basically write everything ourselves without having to now think about any platform in any way. And since we'll be doing the first version of the renderer in software ourselves as well, that means even rendering will not be hand-wavy because we will not be relying on anyone's driver or GPU to do the rendering for us. We'll be doing it ourselves, so we can literally know how every last little pixel got onto the screen, why it was there, why it looks like it does, how it was computed, where it came from, everything will be something that we can look at. And I'm much more excited about that because I think that's going to be really where the interesting stuff lies. I mean, platforms come and go, and there's a million platforms out there, there'll be a million more, and so really that's not that exciting of a part, but it's just something you kind of have to do. So, with all of that, I guess I should do the standard preamble in case we do some code today. Welcome to Handmade Hero. We are on day 26 right now, which means we're about 26 hours into programming this game. I guess if it was a Monday that we started, we're on Thursday or something in the working week, something like that. If we were programming 7 hours a day or something like this. I don't know how much you guys program a day, but however much you program a day, you can figure out where in the week that is after 26 some odd hours.
The problem with that assertion, by the way, is that he assumes that everybody can be as fast as he is, and I'll tell you right now that I'm going to go slower than he does because he's obviously got way more experience, and specifically in games programming. My area of expertise is with web development and working with data. So I've done a lot of SQL work. I've done a lot of different work with different kinds of database technologies, Postgres, SQL Server, just blob stuff. I don't want to belabor that point, but this kind of work is just a lot different from what I am personally good at, or at least what I feel that I'm good at. I'm not, I'll put it this way. I'm an IC3. I'm a level 3 engineer at the company I work for, and so I don't think titles are everything, but that basically makes me like a mid-level engineer, and I'm at like the mid-level in my career. I'm like one step away from senior, if that helps you kind of orient myself. Whereas somebody like Casey, he does his own thing as a contractor, I'm pretty sure. But if he was working for like a big enterprise company, he would be probably like a principal engineer, which is above senior, and I think it's above staff too. I don't know that he would put much stock in that title either, by the way.
We are building an entire game from scratch, and we are building it from scratch for 2 reasons. One, because it's a lot of fun, actually. And I think as we now kind of get away from the Win32 side of things, too, which, like I said, makes things definitely hairier. Now that we're in our own code, it's going to be a lot more fun because everything's under our control. But it's just kind of fun to have complete control of everything and to be able to do whatever you want. I feel is like really very empowering. I kind of like that a lot. So I think it's a lot more fun, and also I think it's very educational. So one of the big reasons I want to do this, obviously this series where we did everything from scratch, was because I really want to be able to show how every little last thing works, because it's so interesting sometimes to find out how these things things work. And a lot of times now, if you just use a prefab game engine or something like that, you don't really ever get to see all of the stuff that happens, and you don't get to learn about it all. So I think it's really an important thing for everyone to do who's a game programmer to do once, to kind of do the whole pipeline once, so they can just kind of see it. It's super educational and cool, I think. So yeah, so I'm looking forward to it, and I hope you are too. If you pre-ordered the game on handmadehero.org, you should have gotten an email with a link that allows you to download the source code anytime you want. That source code zip has days in it. Each day corresponds to one of the days you see on the stream here. So we're on day 26, so you will want to unzip yesterday's source, day 25. Unzip that into a directory, and you will be in the exact same state that I am in right now. So if you want to follow along at home, that's the easiest way to do it, and you will be all set to go. Okay. So I have a bunch of things that I want to talk about tonight, and like I said, I don't know how much coding we'll get to. I said that we're talking about this in the pre-stream. I have a bunch of things that I want to explain because I think that game architecture is not very well understood by a lot of people, and I would also say that just architecture, software architecture in general, is really not understood that well by a lot of people, a lot of people in the programming world. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions. I think there are a lot of dogmas out there that can be very counterintuitive and also perhaps harmful to productivity that yield a worse end product. And so I kind of just wanted to talk a little bit about software architecture, what it means, what the actual sensible things are there, and kind of then move from there into game architecture specifically and kind of how to think about it. Okay, so what I want you to think about for a second, if you will, is the term architecture. Because what's interesting about the term architecture is if you actually consider, am I in a painting mode here? There we go. There we go. If you actually consider what the term architecture comes from, right? It was something that comes obviously from building buildings. But if you think about the process, what happens when you build a building is an architect, right? The person who does architecture, they make a blueprint, right? They make designs for the building. They make a bunch of these blueprints. I don't know if you've ever seen them. They're all in a big roll. There's sometimes they're printed out by the hundreds for complex buildings, and like one blueprint will have like where the plumbing's supposed to go, and another blueprint will have things like how the floor is laid out or where the electricity goes. Who knows? They've got blueprints for all sorts of things. Well, the architects make these blueprints, right? Nowadays they make them on CAD things. And then what happens is, at some point, they hand these blueprinters off to like a contractor, right? There's a contractor, and they've got carpenters and stuff, and they actually build the building using materials, right? So the contractor actually builds the building. And building the building involves lots of stuff, right? Building in the building involves like nailing stuff in, right? Stuff together, right? It involves like masonry. It involves cranes and hauling stuff around. So when people say architect, and they are talking about what we're doing in programming, it's kind of a little confusing to understand really what this means, and I think that it maybe puts up a few barriers to understanding. Because one of the things that's true, if you take a look at this whole process in the world of construction, and we were trying to like use the metaphor directly, is that this right here pretty much tells you everything you need to know to build the building, for the most part. Like if I hand two different contractors the same set of blueprints, modulo like how much how detail oriented they were when they were like nailing the stuff in, like with other little gaps or something like this, how carefully they're doing their job, I'm subsequently going to get the same building out the other side, right? Like I'm not going to have a situation where like one of the buildings was sort of this long rectangular thing, and another one was like some kind of spherical omnidome when I handed off the same blueprint, right? And so if you think about that and what that entails, a lot of people who talk about software architecture take that metaphor kind of literally. Like if you think about things like UML diagrams, I don't know if you've ever seen these sort of things. Basically, there's a bunch of software architecture methodologies that really do try to reproduce this process. They try to make it so that when you are doing the work of software architecture, whatever that means, and we haven't really even defined what I think it means yet, but when you are doing what they think that word means, they essentially believe you are producing a thing which, when handed to people who literally do not have any knowledge about what you were trying to do with the architecture potentially, or how you wanted it done, would substantively build the same essential program out of it, right? So the blueprint is essentially the program, definition or spec, right? This is basically, the family of architecture that a lot of sort of like hardcore object-oriented style stuff goes, a lot of hardcore like pre-planning, diagramming, all that sort of stuff. That is how they look at it, right? Now, in my mind, I don't think that makes much sense at all, personally. The reason that I don't think that makes very much sense is because if you look at how this tends to play out in practice, really, what ends up happening when you try to do things this way is that programs are so complicated and involve so many moving parts that if you could actually make a blueprint that actually does specify the program to a sufficient degree necessary to make it so there isn't any variability in what comes out the other end, then you have essentially just written the program. Like these sorts of things, if you were to actually diagram them out to the level necessary, which some people actually do with these crazy tools, right? You would essentially have something that is more or less the program. Like a programming language sufficiently advanced could probably just spit out the actual end result from that process, right? And I feel like, and I could be wrong about this, but I feel like nowadays, certainly in game programming, but also I think the sentiment that I've heard from most of the people who watch Handmade Hero, is they either explicitly or intuitively, and somewhat implicitly, have that feeling as well. Like if they've seen these sorts of things, they have had the experience that these do not tend to work very well, and that they cause basically a lot of upfront work that just doesn't pay off very much, right? And I feel very strongly about that because everything that I've ever seen that tries to go in that direction, where you have this sort of heavy upfront architecting of things, tends to fail at producing good quality programs in a reasonable amount of time, in my experience. They tend to take too long to produce too poor of a program. So what I would actually propose is that this phrase architect or architecture, right, is actually kind of bad and misleading just to begin with. And if it were up to me, I don't think we would even ever use that phrase. So what I want to propose, oh dear, I don't know, I'm new to this this drawing program, so let's see, fill with background color, there we go. So what I would like to propose is just briefly a way of sort of thinking about this. If you were in the same metaphor, I'd like to say where I actually think the act of software architecture comes in, basically. What I think it comes in is more like urban planner, honestly, right? Like, I think urban planner is actually the job that we're actually doing when we talk about software architecture. Architect, right? Whatever the architecture is, right? Wow, we're just having all kinds of.
It's funny watching him struggle with all, like, he tries probably like 4 or 5 different drawing softwares over the course of the series, and I never even got to the point where he actually busts out a full-on whiteboard. But anyway, I want to let him keep going because he says something, maybe I missed it and you already said it, but this is the video where he talks about, you know, the code kind of being the blueprint, and there's just something that I think is kind of profound about that, you know. One of the problems that I have at my job is that a lot of the time, what a lot of people want to do is kind of hand wave away the way that things work, and I find that leads to a lot of bad assumptions when you actually need to go and do a thing, and then it blows up in your face, and it's like, yeah, all of this work has to happen somewhere. You can't just, you know, wish that you didn't have to do it.
I don't even know how to erase that. We're having like spelling problems. All right, let's see. Do we have an eraser tool? Is there a way to erase things? I don't even know if there is. Help me, Krita. I should really practice with this program first. It's the only one that seemed to actually be working for us. So I assume that it's the one. Is that not selection? How do we select things? I don't even know. All right, fine. We'll just undo. There, you've made me do it, Krita. Okay, there we go. So if I have architect, wow, it's just like I can't draw today. All right, there we go. So we have an urban planner, we have architects, we have contractors, right? I actually think of what people call software architecture as being up here. I think that this is like programming, right? This is design, right? And this is like the compiler, right? So basically, like the thing where things actually get built, that's the compiler. It's basically taking the blueprint, which is our code, and it's turning it into something you can actually use, right? So I say this is the compiler. It's not programmers taking a blueprint from a designer. This is actually what the compiler does. The architect job in real life, where you're making this blueprint, that's programming. And the reason that I think that's like actually what we do day to day when we sit down to program is because programs are very, very malleable, right? The reason that architects in the real world don't program, don't change their blueprints continuously as they build a building is because it's impossible to do so. It's much too costly. It's not because it's better, right? It's not because it's easier to have to pre-plan an entire building before you build it. If cost and time were no issue at all, you would much rather have the architect be able to just constantly fuss with the structure of the building through its entire production cycle, so they could build the lobby, see that the lobby was like oriented not quite right to the sun, so like change it and just move the lobby over to a new place so that it gets better sun, right? That's what they would love to be able to do that. But they can't, because building things in the real world is just costs too much money and takes too much time. So the act of pre-planning the architecture of a building is entirely because of real world constraints. In programming, we have much more malleable structures of things. So the concept that we would want to do what they do and fix, sort of the blueprint ahead of time just doesn't hold water. We want our thing to always be malleable because we will be able to do a much better job. Just like an architect would be able to do a much better job designing their building if they had the ability to constantly mutate it, right?
That analogy is what I was talking about just a few moments ago. I think that is so spot on because in the real world, this is something I've been grappling with my whole career so far. I've been working as a programmer, software engineer, whatever you want to call it, for 7 years now. And when you can't change things down the road, you have to make sure you get things right up front. And so that's where he's saying, the urban planner will design the thing, and then the architect creates the blueprint and then hands it off to the contractors that actually go and do the work. And when you're writing code, you're basically creating that blueprint, which gets handed over to the compiler to then do the thing. And we have the advantage. It's both a blessing and a curse that when you're working on software, you can change things after they've shipped. It's what's led to, I think, in a large part, the state we're in today, where a game just does not work on the first day that it launches a lot of the time. Instead, it's busted until you get that day one update, right? And you have to sit and wait for your game to download the update and install it for however long that takes. If you're like me and you have crappy internet, you could be waiting all night and you won't get to play your new game. Nutella, congratulations on finishing your first year of school today. That's awesome. Good for you.
So I think that's actually what we're doing here, and I think we would apply the same principles during programming. Like I talk a lot about compression-oriented programming, right? Where we sort of just splat things out and then we see how they take shape and then we sort of abstract them as necessary and rework things, all that sort of stuff. Very fluid. I think that's the same way you would build a building if you could, right? It just would result in buildings that were so much better than what we have today for the same basic amount of time. Because again, mutating code isn't really that difficult as long as you don't try to
Gotta love that great internet. I think this has got to be because of Restream chewing up the output. Because when I was streaming directly to Twitch, I did a bandwidth test streaming directly to Twitch, and I also did one going to YouTube privately, and they both worked fine. But granted, I didn't, the YouTube stream test was not very thorough. If I look, I like how Restream is telling me that my connection is excellent. Hopefully I can figure that out and it'll tell me why. I just want to know where the bottleneck is. If it's Restream, then I just know I have to either use a different server or just cut out Restream, but we'll see. I feel like people who programmed with punch cards thought the same way when programming on the computer directly came to be a thing. I don't even want to think about that. That sounds horrible.
I'm going to architect this thing. I'm telling you about the architecture of this thing. What do they draw? They don't draw things that look anything like blueprints compared to code, right? They don't draw something that essentially sketches out the exact structure of the program as the CPU would execute it or anything like that. What they do is they draw these kind of diagrams. They'll do stuff like they'll draw something that looks like this, right? They'll say, oh, here's the Win32 part, and here's the engine, right? And here's, this is the game, and here's this library that we licensed or whatever, and it calls down to this, right? They draw what.
Where did I go wrong? You'd think I'm just trying to stream like 4K at 60 FPS. I think I'm just outputting 1080p, and maybe I am trying to push 60 FPS, but I don't think I can change anything about that while I'm live. So I don't know. I'll do some more stream tests and hopefully I can figure that out. I'm sorry about that. Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it.
Because it's wrong. When we talk about software architecture, unfortunately, we're talking actually about a completely different thing in the real world. We're talking about the high-level zoning and traffic strategy for our virtual city, right? We're talking about thinking through roughly where each thing has to be and what it should do, and how much it's going to cost us and how efficient it's going to be for us to move things between them. That is really what we're talking about, right? And I feel like that's an important thing to kind of get straight, especially if you're a beginner, because a lot of times you're going to see people use this architecture term, and they're using it to talk about many different things that aren't all the same, and some of them are good things to pay attention to, some of them are actually very deleterious and you should avoid. And so I just want to kind of frame it a little bit differently than it's typically framed as we go into this, so that it's a little clearer in people's heads who maybe aren't familiar with some of these processes. Okay. So what are we trying to do? I'm now going to go ahead and get a little more specific. We're in metaphor land here, and I only wanted to do that because people are often talking in these metaphors, and I kind of wanted to confront those up front. But from now on, we don't really need much in the way of metaphors because I can talk about actual specifics now that you know that what we're trying to do. So basically, in software architecture, just architecture in general, you are trying to come up with strategies for doing what essentially amounts to separation of code, right? And there's a number of reasons that we do this. But basically, separation or boundaries, right, basically, depending on how you want to think of this. This is mostly what we're doing when we're talking about code. And again, it fits with the urban planning thing very concisely. It's about drawing that property map that says, here's where everything's going to live. They don't overlap. Here's the traffic patterns that connect them, right? And here is what each thing is supposed to be about. What does this section of our city do? That sort of thing. Architecture is mostly about defining these. And the reason that you want to define them are usually for either reuse, right? That's a big one, because I want to be able to have components that are easy to reuse, for example. So maybe I want to separate my code in a way that, for example, on Handmade Hero, with our Win32 prototyping layer, right now, it really doesn't know very much about the game whatsoever. So if we wanted to turn that into a reusable platform layer, it wouldn't take very much work, because we've done a good job separating it out from what's going to be the game. So if you think about that, that is a compelling reason to draw separation, to put hard separation into large chunks of your code, because then you can take those and reuse them and don't have to write them again. That's one reason, right? Another reason is division of labor, right? So basically, if I think about trying to write this code, Handmade Hero, I'm writing it all by myself. So that's not really a problem. But let's say I had 2, 3, 4 programmers on this team, or worst case, you've got some like project that's like an operating system project that's got 500 people on it or something. Well, we need to kind of have different people working on different stuff so that the communication requirements between them doesn't overwhelm the entire project, right? If each of us is all working on whatever code we want anytime we want, when things start to get scale up in the number of programmers, that becomes prohibitively expensive because we would constantly not know what each person is doing and we constantly work across purposes. So division of labor is another reason that software architecture typically comes into place. Another one is simply like mental clarity, right? And it's weird to list that one, but it really is a sort of important part of things, which is that when you tackle very large programs, and this actually is true regardless of how many people you have, whether there's a division of labor or not, when you tackle very large programs, there is a challenge to most people, most programmers, in keeping the entire thing in your head. As you get up to larger and larger programs and larger complexities, sometimes your architecture is more about keeping things separate so you don't have to consider them at once. And the reason I say that is because if you imagine that there was no separation between anything in the code and every last little thing has a bearing on something else and how it works, if that is constantly in flux, then any change I make to my program has consequences for the rest of the program. And that is essentially, you could think of it as an n squared. We haven't talked about this yet, but for those of you who know what that is, you could think of this as an n squared problem for your brain. Your brain, every time it makes a change, has to go consider all other possible parts in the code. And so for every, for the total number of changes that you have to do for the project, each piece of code that you make a change to essentially affects all the other pieces of code. So if the pieces of code were numbered n, then each, if you have to do a change to, however many, I guess it's n squared, but it's really, I guess you might even say it's worse than n squared, because
this thing he's describing, I've always felt this way. I still feel this way, where when I try to grapple with the amount of complexity going in every direction with software, you're really talking about a matrix that every time you add an input somewhere and an output somewhere else, you're adding like a row and a column to that matrix, and it just goes and goes and goes. If you remember that scene from Interstellar when he's, and spoilers, sorry, spoiling like a 10-year-old movie or something, but when he's in the Tesseract, he goes into the black hole and he's like in time, he's in between time and space, and he's seeing everything in every direction like a big matrix. He's in a big cube, and it's just, he's seeing all these moments in time going forwards and backwards. That's how it can feel to try and wrangle all of the crap you have to wrangle into your head when you're thinking about a really complex software system, because you're not subject to a three-dimensional problem space, right? Like he uses the urban planner example to talk about how the urban planner designs the way the streets and the buildings all have to fit together, hands it off to the architect, which comes up with a blueprint for a building or a bridge or whatever. But in software, you're not limited to 3D space. You can make it as complex as you want, and that causes people to lose their minds trying to come up with something concrete which can give them an empirical path forward to a good solution. And I don't think we're there yet. And I think we've had some examples of people trying to do that. There's this thing called clean code, which Casey made a video on like a year or two ago, criticizing at length and explaining why. I think he came away with it saying that like maybe one or two of the principles of this supposed set of guidelines that was actually worth following. I think it had something to do with not repeating yourself. Don't write the same piece of code over and over and over. You just want one piece of code that does the one thing one time, and instead of having a bunch of duplicate stuff everywhere. Yeah, Devil, it's kind of like that, isn't it?
N is the number of pieces of code, and M is the number of changes, which is often actually higher than N. So it's really actually worse than N squared, but it's at least N squared. Because the number of changes times the number of pieces of code is what you end up with as you get towards the end of the project is crazy complicated, right? Every time you make a change, you have to consider every piece of code in the system and how it might affect it. So sometimes we do that kind of separation, simply not because there's any actual practical reason, but rather just because doing anything less would be simply too much brain power to make progress, and either you will spend too much time thinking about each individual change, and that will slow your rate down, or you'll just make mistakes because you forget to consider certain pieces of the code that are depending on the thing that you're changing. Okay. So this is typically why, right? This is why we do software architecture, right? And then we also have other things to think about here, which, if that's the why, this is sort of the how, which is things we want to accomplish, or I shouldn't say how. It's not really how. This is sort of like our goals, I guess you might say, in terms of like when we are doing these things, right? When we are trying to accomplish these things. Even goals is a bad word. I don't know what I'm going to call this. I'm going to list them out first, and then maybe we can think of what the word is, because I'm not sure what the word is that quite encompasses what I'm talking about. But basically, I guess, you know what we could say? We could maybe say there are some metrics. There are some things we could measure, right? There are some measurements that we're trying to think about as we're doing this that have some bearing on when we do these sorts of separations. And typically these are things like sort of temporal coupling, for example, right? Like when I am making, and you can think of this is sort of like thinking about the quality of our little city that we're building here. One thing we could think about when we're actually doing this thing, we're kind of starting to break up stuff into pieces, we have a bunch of different things that we need to think about between those pieces. So temporal coupling is like, I have two pieces that I've sort of separated. I've drawn boundaries between them. When they occur, and I mean literally the time at which they can occur in the program, that may not be arbitrary. An example would be, let's say I have a physics system, and I've drawn a boundary around that, right? I've said this is one component, so I've separated it out, right? And I have a renderer, right? And I've separated that out. Oops. Renderer, right? So this is responsible for drawing the game, you know, and this is responsible for moving the things in the game, okay? Well, if that's the case, then obviously I can't just run these two things completely randomly. There's some kind of a temporal coupling between these two that says something along the lines of, this has to produce data, right, that this can read, or something, right? Because if this is what's moving things and this has to render them, then we know that we can't render the stuff for a frame until the physics has computed what that thing has done for the frame, right? So there's often temporal coupling in there. Similarly, there's like layout coupling as well, right? Like basically if this has to spit out stuff that this can read, well then there's a directional coupling this way that basically says, okay, whatever data this thing spits out, this thing is now dependent on that format of the data, and that could have implications for performance. Maybe this thing wanted it in a different way, and this thing wants it in a different way, and now we have to figure out, do we translate between the two ways, or does we try to make one work with the other one's way, and blah, 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 right? So we can have a coupling like in the layout of things, right? We can also you know, have some other metrics up here, right? Which is sort of just the, I don't know what you want to call it. We could call it sort of an ideological coupling, right? Which is to say that we may, especially when it comes down to this reuse thing, we may have some things to think about that are just about how, what is sort of the way in general that these things work, and does that have a bearing on where we could possibly use them? Some examples of that would be like, you know, is this thing multi-threaded? Does it have to work with a job system? That sort of thing. There may be stuff that's just how you wrote the code in general, internal to this, has sort of a bearing on what sorts of systems it can slot into, just at its basis. Another one would be, so some examples there would be like threading, memory, like what kind of way does it look at memory? How does it use that? Width of computation. So like, is it SIMD? Does it use SSE? These sorts of things. Can it? You know, those sorts of things. When we write things, we've got a bunch of things that sort of have to, that may tie code down to a particular way of working that we need to be aware of, right? So we have lots of stuff to think about here, and this is by no means exhaustive, but it's just an example of the sorts of stuff that we're thinking about when we go to actually do sort of the software architecture, if you will. Now, there's one more that I'm going to put on here, which is not a coupling thing, and this is the metrics. But this is basically like, I'm going to just say fluidity, right? Fluidity is very abstract and difficult to measure. It's one of those things where you know it when you see it, but it's pretty hard to say like what you would measure exactly, or how you could really say ahead of time what would or would not be fluid. But what I mean by that is, there are architectures that may do very well by all of the metrics that you might look at here, like in terms of coupling, and they perform well, they're efficient, they were written well internally, that sort of thing. So everything about them's good. There's nothing. The architecture is not doing anything wrong in terms of providing these things in terms of setting the stage for the particular parts that it then have to get implemented inside that architecture. It's done a good job setting the stage for it to all be successful, and it can be written very successfully, and you're done, right? But it might be very fragile, or I should say perhaps too sort of stuck in the way that it's designed, such that if for some reason some of those architecture decisions turn out to be wrong, changing them becomes disastrously difficult, right? It could be that you've made it such that everything has to work the way the architecture was designed, and any change to it, everything comes crashing down. Then there may be other architectures which maybe don't score quite as highly on some of the other things you might measure, but they may have a great deal of fluidity in them, where they can basically handle like, oh, we got kind of partway through it and turned out this was a bad idea, and so we could rework it very quickly, that sort of thing. That can be very, very valuable on projects, especially if you're not sure what the architecture should be. And the first time you do any type of system, you're probably not sure what the architecture is going to be. And so that fluidity, much like with when I say the sort of the semantic, the sort of the compression-oriented programming, right? Having the ability to constantly rework things quickly in your architecture is very valuable as well if you can get it. Now, sometimes because you're talking about such big pieces, that may not be easy to do. That may be very difficult. And so it's by no means necessarily true that a architecture that isn't fluid anymore is bad. It may be just that you've gotten to the point of complexity where fluidity is just not possible anymore. And so again, one of the things you try to do, much like with the semantic programming approach, is you try not to lock things down in the architecture any earlier than you have to until you've sort of tried some things and seen, that they work, at least in one case, before you sort of make steps in those directions, specifically for the same exact reason you don't do it when you're talking about just regular ordinary code, right?
Whoops, thanks for calling that out. What he's talking about here, it reminds me of a terrible engineering decision I made back when I started my company, which is not, I was pretty green when I started my company. And so am I still muted? I unmuted myself, didn't I? Quit yelling at me. Him gulping at 2 times speed is funny. It is a little bit funny. Anyway, I made that terrible decision, and it's kind of related to what he's talking about now. And if I had just a little bit more experience, I would have not made that choice that I made. And it's caused so much pain for me and the startup that I founded. And I'm finally right about to correct that decision 5 years later. And I can't tell you how good it feels to get to that point where I can be, fluid again and make changes without having to fight a whole lot of just fighting a bad design decision. It can show up in so many different places, and it's been hell for me. But again, it's very satisfying to work to get to that place where I can be fluid and not be fighting that bad decision anymore. It's going to feel really good. I'll be able to move a lot faster, get a lot more done a lot more quickly. Still impressive that you did a startup like that. Yeah, well, it's not that I did it. I'm still doing it. I'm doing it all the time. I'm pretty much always working on it because there's still a lot of work to do if we're going to turn it into a success. So, but what's nice about these streams is it's going to give me a good way to kind of unplug from that a little bit and learn some different skills, something else that interests me, and it'll kind of feed back into itself and make me that much more creative, expose me to new ways of thinking about solving problems. That'll just make me better at contributing to my day job and working on my business.
So, with that in mind, let's talk about a few specific sorts of things here. I think that's a good enough sort of a good quick background on software architecture and what's sort of going on there. So I'm going to talk about the actual game architecture now and sort of how all that applies. All right, so game architecture. You now know one part of how I think game architecture should go. And again, architecture is one of those things that you kind of build up over time, techniques on how you like to architect things, much like how you build up over time techniques on how you like to write code at the lower levels. So what I want to kind of talk about is how the sort of game architecture process works. And one thing that you've already seen, though, is you've kind of seen me cheat a little bit. And this is because I don't even know how to not do the cheating anymore. But basically, I already know what I think is a good architecture for a prototyping layer and a platform layer, both. So we have down at the very bottom of everything, right? We've got Win32, and we've got OpenGL or Direct3D, these sorts of things, right? Oops, Direct3D. So we basically have some stuff underneath us that we can't do anything about. It's there and it's designed the way it's designed, right? And I already showed you how to basically make. There's a platform layer here, right? And I already showed you basically how I think that thing should be designed. Now, we didn't code a proper platform layer because, like I said, we only did the prototype version. We'll do the more proper version down the line. But the architecture, the way it's structured, is roughly what I would normally do. This platform layer talks to Win32 and talks to whatever the graphics library is eventually. Right now, we are fortunate in that we don't actually have to really do that because we're just pushing a bitmap, so we're kind of just doing it through the Win32 API. But eventually, we'll have to deal with that because we're going to need to use one of these guys for hardware acceleration. So eventually, this will be there. But we wrote this code, and we basically had 2 ports in it. There's game update and render was was game. I guess game update and render. Let's say GUAR, game update and render, right? We have game update and render, and we have get sound samples, right? Those were the 2 things really where data is flowing back and forth. And you might actually, I don't know how you I never find these diagrams to be all that necessary to be specific. I'm just going to point to them to talk about parts. So I don't even care which direction these arrows are going, but one way we might say is that it actually looks like this, right? Because really game update and render, these things go back to the game, right? And get sound samples, right? So basically these things call into the game, but really with no loss of resolution here, this is essentially what we've already done, right? We have the operating system. This was written by Microsoft, right? We have this platform layer, which we wrote the prototype of, and we wrote that for the first 25 hours, right? That's what we did. And now we're going to talk about doing this part right here, right?
So what he's going over here with these boxes he's drawn is basically what I was trying to demonstrate earlier on in the stream, and I failed miserably to do so. That is the way that he designed the code to work together in those first 25 days is he made it so that you could easily reload the code while you're working on, you know, gameplay logic. There isn't much logic to the gameplay right now, but eventually as time goes on, you get to a point where it'll be easy to make changes and watch them unfold, because you can just rebuild the game. Whereas that capability, you might have to overcome a lot of bad decision making to get that same functionality if you went a different road. It's inspiring how you talk in such a way to improve and enjoy yourself. Learning skills to help you with your job that you're genuinely interested in is great. Yeah, I think that's, you know, what makes a large part of life rewarding. You know, if you can enjoy the work that you do, and if you can find a way to always be improving that process, it's going to make life a lot less boring and a lot less stagnant.
So the reason I said that I cheated is because I didn't have to go through the learning steps on the stream of how to design a good platform layer. I just already know how to do it because I've done it probably something like 15 times. I don't know. I've written a lot of platform layers in my day. So I pretty much know what makes me happy about a platform layer, and I pretty much know exactly how I want it to look. So when I sit down to write a new one, it's really kind of just a rote process at this point. I just know what it should look like and what it should do, and it's just a question of me fussing with the OS to get it to do it. That's it, right? So I really couldn't show you anything about the architecture process in here because it was just a given. And I couldn't even really, there's no way for me to really pretend that I didn't already have a goal in mind, because I do, right? With the game, we're going to be much more fortunate in that respect, because I have no idea how to architect this game. I mean, that's not entirely true, because since I've written game code before, and game system code specifically, I do have experience architecting games. But every game's architecture is usually a bit different depending on sort of what genre the game is, what sorts of stuff it needs to do. And so I don't know a priori exactly how this game's architecture should look. So over the next several months as we build the game, I will be going through the same sorts of steps that I normally go through to improve and refine on architectures, specifically as sort of like part of the core goal of the stream is to show that kind of stuff. So we will actually be doing a lot more talking about that as we go. So the only thing that I really want to talk about tonight in our last 20 minutes is sort of what are some of the principles of game architecture, things, you know, that I've learned and that I kind of think are true from past experience, to sort of set us up for as we start to go through and do this kind of programming. What are we looking at? What are we trying by default first? What are some of the techniques that we're going to use? That sort of stuff. So I'm just going to talk about that a little bit. Okay. So inside the game, oops, what is the...
Have I done a lot of object-oriented programming? Not too much. I've never really worked at a job. Well, I guess it's not totally true. The kinds of, I would say the kinds of object-oriented programming I've done have been very shallow. I used to write a lot of Ruby at work, but as the years went on, Ruby just became not part of my job anymore as we started adopting different tech and moving in a different direction. But even when I was writing Ruby, the object-orientedness of it was just insofar as one of the most popular frameworks to use with the Ruby programming language is Rails, which is a web framework, and Rails uses a lot of object-oriented stuff to do clever things with the way that you build, controllers and access different parts of the framework's capabilities. There's just a lot of oops stuff going on that I'd never really understood all that well. I just knew how to use it to do what I needed to get done. And so is the amount that I would do is essentially just encapsulating some data in an object, really not that's not even specific to like you can define Odin, the language that I'm using to work on Handmade Hero, calling it Odinmade Hero, right? It doesn't have objects. It doesn't have classes. It has structs, and it's kind of the same thing as a class in that you say this is what my class has. It has these different attributes to it, and you store some data in there. But that's about as far as it goes.
Hotkey for fill with background color. Backspace. There we go. All right. So let's talk about that big old block that just said game on it, right? That big old block that we had. We're now inside that block, right? Well, so one thing that I talked about originally, or that I did, I should say, is game, update, and render, right? That's one of our M3 points, right? In fact, I'm just going to keep using Guar from now on, I think. So we kind of know, right? I'm going to invert this from the diagram before so we can have kind of a downward flow of things. Or maybe, you know what, maybe we'll do it from the side. I don't know. So we're going to get a game update and render call from the app, right? So we basically now know that our game update, our game architecture is based around getting a call that says, here's a t for how much time basically has elapsed. How much time do we need to advance things by? So we basically need to do a t update to advance the state of the game, right? We need to do a rendering, so we need to render to the bitmap that it gives us, right? That sort of stuff. And implicit in this here, in this t update advance, is that we have to process the user input that it passed us, right? Because it's going to pass us the keyboard control and the gamepad control, right? That's what's going to happen here in that sort of advanced thing. We're going to render to the bitmap, and then when we don't even have to really think of this as a separate call. We have to be able to handle it as a separate call. But the get sound samples stuff really is just an extension of this. If I would have preferred it, and in fact we had it this way originally. If I felt like we could get away with it, and maybe we will eventually, depending on how we go, I would actually have this be right here. I'd actually have output sound samples actually be something that just happens as part of the game update and render call, and not have a separate call. So really, I like to think of the game as getting a single sort of point in time where it goes, okay, now's the time to do all your work from the platform layer, and there's nothing else that's going to go on here, right? So let's talk about these things, because I think they're basically endemic to all games, and well, I guess I'll keep them separate for now. I'm going to say AV output can kind of usually be lumped together because they're very similar processes. Sound is usually basically a subset of the complexity of graphical rendering. But so what actually has to go on in these things, and what is our game architecture going to be concerned about? So I'll just state some pretty straightforward stuff right off the bat. So regardless of how much multi-threading we do or anything else we might do, right? We know that essentially, if our game loop has user input in it, we want to process the user input first, we want to update the state of the world, and we want to render, right? Now, the user input, we always want to process as close to the updating as possible to reduce input lag, right? You could imagine us processing the input, like we could update the world, render the game, right? Not do this at the outset, and then take a look at the input and process it here. If we did that, we would essentially be introducing a frame of lag, right? Because we did an update even without considering input that we actually had at the time. So definitely what we want to do, right, is we always want to basically say, okay, input gets integrated in the update right away, right? We don't want to hold it over. So we know that basically this update, whatever we do to update the world, we're going to have to take into account the input right there. So the question is, right, or I shouldn't say the question is, but basically we know that if we look at our sequence of operations, we know that the very first thing we're going to have to do is look at that user input, right? And then the next thing that we're going to do is something else, right? And we don't know exactly what it's going to be, but we know that we want this to be as close to the head end as possible, right? So let's talk about update and render. A lot of games will do something where they have like update, right? And that's something that they do, a step. And then they actually have another step that's like render. So rendering and updating are totally separate, right? I can appreciate that from a ideological standpoint, certainly. Saying that I want to be able to update the game separately from rendering it makes sense in terms of a desired set of operations. I might want to update the game. I might want to render the game. Maybe I don't want to do one or the other. Maybe I want to do both, that sort of thing. Maybe I want to update the game 2 times and then only render it once, blah, 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 blah. So if you think about what this means, you may write the code the way I just said, where you've got an update step that you call separately, right, and a render step that you call separately, and these are different functions. So essentially, when we start to think about the things I was talking about in the architecture, you're drawing one of those boundaries. You're drawing a boundary between update and render. I never draw that boundary, if I can help it, and here's why. If you think about the way modern computers work a lot of the times, is they have a very high penalty for missing the cache, right? A CPU really likes to be able to do things in its cache, right? A CPU has some amount of cache, however much it is. It pulls things into that cache when it's working on them, and while they are in that cache, if they do not get evicted, as long as you can process stuff within that cache, you get massively faster. You know, you're talking 10, 20 times faster, sometimes more, because the time it takes to go out and get stuff from memory is very long. So unless you can accurately predict exactly what memory you're going to need quite a bit before you need it, there's not a lot you can do to work around those kinds of problems. Since that is true, I usually find that it is not a good idea to say that as an architectural decision, your updating and rendering are split. Take for a very simple example, let's say I have some kind of fancy particle system in my game. And so there's 16,000 particles. And I have to loop through all 16,000 particles, and I need to do some kind of physics update on them. And then I need to produce some stuff in a vertex buffer that's going to get sent to a graphics card to render them, right? Well, if I actually loop over all of those things twice, once in the update to update where they are, and then once in the renderer to render them, at the very least, position and probably velocity, probably potentially also color, are getting pulled into the cache and evicted from the cache 2 times, right? They're getting done on the update pass and on the render pass. So it would be much more efficient if we just did it in one pass to produce both things, right? And so I do not like to draw that boundary. For some things, it's fine to have that boundary happen, but at the game architecture level, I never draw that boundary. I don't like to put it there. I like to have update render basically be one coherent step, right, that happens together, if that makes sense. So this is actually what I do. I do not ever do, something that looks like this. I never do that if I can avoid it, because basically I feel like this is a much saner way to go in terms of when you need to actually start optimizing for performance, acknowledging the fact that there are many types of things that want to get updated and rendered together. And render is kind of a difficult term here because render in the final version of the game is not really about rendering. It's about stuffing things in buffers that eventually go off to a GPU. But you know what I mean. So sort of this term render, think of that more as render prep. Because nobody actually does rendering anymore. And in our case, we won't really be doing that either. It's input, update, render, and then GPU or whatever is doing its thing. We will also have that step, right? Only in our case, we will be implementing the actual code that, and on the CPU, so it won't be on a GPU, right? So really there's that final step. So when I say render, I just want to make it clear what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the thing that prepares all of the buffers for the graphics subsystem to handle, which is normally on a GPU, but in our case, for the first couple months, it's going to be our own renderer.
I've heard him explain that stuff about the cache twice now. I probably need to watch it 5 more times to really understand the nuance there. But one thing that I know I've seen a lot more of over the past 2 or 3 years is that more and more people are trying to talk about how important not missing the cache is. If you can keep as many things in the cache as you can when you're doing something that needs to be high performance, you'll be better off. And I haven't had the opportunity professionally to use that information because I am generally constrained by the tools that I am using, and the tools that I am using, they simply, for instance, my bottleneck for what I do professionally is pretty much always the database. I'm always trying to optimize how fast the queries that I write will run, and that can mean completely untangling them and restructuring them. It can mean changing the layout of the data in the database, but I'm forced to work on optimizing my queries. I can't just pull the raw bytes out and do so as cache effectively as possible the way that he's talking about here. Or if I can, I'm not intelligent enough to put it together to figure out how to do that. I'd have to write my own database, right, and do all the things that go into that to where I could start taking advantage of. And the thing is too, is those queries are all written to do a lot of that underneath the hood. But if there was a way for me to do it, go direct and not go through the database, then I would have that complete control over making it as fast as I am personally capable of making it. Anyway. Just an aside. Sild Graph, not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. Really appreciate the explanations beforehand instead of just copy my code. Yeah, he does a really good job of that. While he's coding, he'll do a lot of explanation, and you'll see that if you stick around and watch. I think the next day here, there might be a bit more explanation, and then we'll finally dive into some code, which is good because that'll give me a chance to really get the structure of the stream looking good. I think it's been going okay since the internet stopped blowing up on me. Of course, now that I've said that, it's going to blow up on me any second. Wanting to learn game dev as well. Rooting for you and your continued success, man. Proud of you. Thanks, Kalo, or Calo. Again, not sure pronouncing words on the internet. You're a huge part of my younger years. I'm glad you're doing well and pursuing what you enjoy. Thank you, Zapsy. Kind of similar to optimizing if statements. Yeah, just optimizing code in general. Well, specifically thinking about the data that your code is operating on. And this is something that working through this series that Casey has done has helped change my thinking quite a bit, is that you really shouldn't be thinking so much about how the code should look or how it feels to work with the code. maybe that's not right. I'll back up. You shouldn't be thinking about how the language does what it does. You should be thinking, and these are basically words that I've stolen from him. He articulated it better than I could on this podcast that I just saw him on. But he said, you shouldn't be thinking about how the language does what the language does. You should be thinking about the data that it operates on, or the performance of it, because that's something that you can actually measure, right? Like a lot of people focus on things that you can't really get empirical about, like code cleanliness. Like, what does that mean? It's kind of arbitrary depending on who you are and what you think looks neat. But performance is something you can actually measure.
Okay. So
I'm really glad you said that, Nutella. I'm glad that you're saying you're invested in it, because that's kind of my goal. Is I want to share, this whole niche, this whole side of working on games that is a lot, it's a smaller slice of the industry. You'll see a lot of people will just go and try and build a game in Unreal, because Unreal gives you all this stuff out of the box. But for me, like, I want to build the engine. I don't necessarily want to use the engine. That's just how my brain has always worked. I don't want to drive the car. I want to build the car. I can't tell you why. That's just how my brain works.
This runs sort of in parallel with another part of the game architecture, right? So we have our input that's got to come in and be integrated first. That may be integrated directly into this, but I think actually probably most of the time it won't be. I think it'll be a separate step that happens here, just because there's not a lot to do with input processing. It's not a performance critical thing usually. You're just setting some state that then gets used by the update later. So this will probably be a separate part that's just like the player control code that, that executes something like that. You do the update and render, and then basically we do now know that architecturally speaking, we're going to get some other call down here that's a separate list of things that have to happen, which is sound output, right? And so these things have to pull from somewhere. So what I want to talk about now is where these things pull from, basically. I really wish I knew how to erase stuff in a diagram. I realize that may be too much to ask here. Let's take a look. Nope, that's not it. Let's try again. There we go. Can I select, like deselect stuff? Is that on the table? Select. Control-Shift-A. Control-Shift-A. There we go. Oops. There we go. All right. So basically, I'm saying that our architecture would draw boundaries roughly like this. Right? We have to draw this boundary because the platform layer drew it for us. We have to draw this boundary because this is, we don't draw this boundary, but I'm saying I probably will. So there's another boundary that we have that is kind of a parallel style boundary. And what I want you to think about is basically where this stuff is getting its data from, right? So there's one form of game architecture, which is sort of the loading screen architecture, I would call it. Okay. The loading screen architecture is the one where you have some event, which is your change level or something event, and you go into some kind of a loading screen. And the loading screen then goes through all the assets that it thinks it's going to need for whatever it is that it's doing, whatever it's about to do, like whatever game level you're about to play, that sort of thing. And the user gets to sit there and watch a little spinning thing and a quote from one of the characters in the game or something like this, or a pro tip like press reload quickly to reload quicker or something like that. During that time, what happens is the resources for the game are being loaded from somewhere, right? So resources are coming in. Usually they're coming in off of a disk of some kind. Oftentimes it's optical if you're on a console, but then it's like HD or SD drive if you're on a PC, right? These things are coming in. Sometimes they can even come over a network. I'm getting a little close to my head there. I don't know if I can. There we go. So essentially what happens is at some point you've got to get these resources out because steps here depend on it. At least this step does, right? And possibly this step too, depending on how we choose to do our sound output, whether it's buffered. But if we decide to do a way where the output just does a quick thing, there would be a 3 in here, which is sound prep, right? Where it prepares the output for what this will get handed back. So either way, somebody, sound-wise, is pulling off of these resources. So basically we have AV resources here, right, at the very least. Now we may have other things. This is a procedural game, so we probably won't. But so in addition to AV, you may have D as well. Audio, video, and just data, right, like gameplay. We could call it G, like level structures, that sort of stuff. That can be in there too, right? So we've got these resources. I may call them S, structural resources. I don't know, because they could be structural for audio video as well. Like here's a graph of different meshes that have to get loaded. Who knows? So this resource part is also an architectural part, and I'll kind of start to explain why. In the loading screen style of doing things, there really is no architecture concern as far as the loading part goes. I mean, there is a little bit, but not very much. The reason is because essentially you're not talking about one integrated system. You're talking about two systems that run completely separately, so there isn't much of an architecture concern. When you have to load, you load, and none of this stuff is happening, right? And when you are done loading, you do this, and then you never load in here, right? So the full-on loading screen mentality is one where you basically don't really have to think too hard about how this architecture is going to work. But there's another way of doing this, which is the streaming mentality, right? So if I go ahead and say, let's not do that, oops, never gonna get used to that. Let's say we don't want to do that.
It's probably worth pointing out that most games are doing things with a loading screen these days, right? I mean, I'm not playing too many games as of the last 4 or 5 years, but I'm trying to remember if Elden Ring really had a lot of loading screens. It's been 2 years since I played it, and I genuinely cannot remember. The only mainstream engine I have eyes on is Source 2. Yeah, I'd be interested to hear more about it. I mean, Source was obviously such a huge part of even my old channel, where it was like, I think I had a pretty good chunk of stuff I was making that was all Gary's mod, right? And so did many other people. I made a decent chunk of a 3D software renderer, but never actually got to the game part. Yeah, that happens. It's kind of like a stereotype for people that like to work on engines. The Rust community in particular gets a lot of critique for having like 30 game engines that the language that are built in Rust, but like no games that are built with Rust. And you know, that's a hard pill to swallow, but you know, it takes a lot of time to do something as substantial as make a game engine from scratch, and just because it does take a lot of work doesn't mean it's not worth doing or understanding, because if nobody takes it upon themselves to learn those skills, then eventually nobody has those skills anymore. All of the old graybeards have retired, and now we're all trying to figure out how to use Unreal, but nobody knows how to fix it when something blows up or whatever. Elden Ring was open world, so only loading screens on teleport or death. Yeah, that sounds about right. I do remember it not being so bad with Elden Ring, and it's probably for that exact reason. There just wasn't that many in the open world aspect of it. That's like the last game to really grab me. I'm trying to remember if there's been another one. I started playing Skyrim again a few months back when Levi was born, and I did not touch it after I went back to work. I haven't played Skyrim in like 8 weeks now, but that was the last time. And Skyrim obviously has its fair share of loading screens. Source 2 pre-baked lighting and real time is insanely good. Yeah, I need to take another look, because I remember watching like a trailer right when they announced Counter-Strike 2 and everything, but I haven't paid too much attention to what's going on with Source 2.
So what we want to do is we want to do streaming. Now what streaming is something where we say, okay, I don't want the user to have to sit through a loading screen. And I want to be able to maybe have very large worlds as well, so I don't want them to have to like hit parts in the world where they like have to stop and it loads, like, you know, I don't know, the old Half-Life, kind of you walk around a corner and you go, and it's gotta load, you know, whatever. I don't want to, you know, have any of that. I want the game to just boot and run, and it always just goes and gets the resources that it needs kind of in the background using, you know, because there's obviously lots of resources now for doing that sort of thing on the computer. There's a lot more firepower that you have in terms of being able to run things concurrently. So assuming that that's the case, you want to make one of these streaming things, you do now have another architectural boundary that you have to draw here, right? You've got an architectural boundary where there's essentially a two-way communication. There's this side of things has to be able to tell this side of things what it needs.
I missed this. I'm invested as well. I've done little game jams with friends, but have always found coding hard to understand. I understand your statement of wanting to build cars and engines rather than drive them. Did I already read that? And my brain is fried. It's that time of the day. Would you like a play test invite for Valve's new game, Deadlock? Sure. I'm not sure when I'd have time to play it, but that'd be fun. Hit me up in whispers and I'll try to get you back.
And then when those things are ready, there has to be a way to communicate back so that it can actually know that they're there and can use them, right? Now, this is a fuzzy back and forth because what you choose to do there affects how you might think of those arrows. But this is basically, you know, the situation. You've got a kind of bi-directional linkage that goes with these sorts of things. This is going to be a very, very important part of our architecture to think about as well, because a lot of people do this very poorly, this part. And it's also where, you know, I know a lot of people have asked about IM GUI, right? Immediate mode graphical user interface. Well, IM GUI is really just a special case of IM design. Like, you can design any architecture to be IM or RM, basically. IM is immediate mode, for those of you who don't know. And RM is retained mode. Okay? Immediate mode is a way of describing an API boundary where the calling side does not have to remember handles to the target side. So the classic example here would be like in a rendering API, where these terms first came from, to the best of my knowledge, are IM and RM. If I have to call you to set up like a scene graph. I say like create a node in my scene and it's got this transform and give it this mesh, and then create another node that's a child of that mesh, and I create this like scene graph, and then I say render, right, at the end, and the library is responsible for doing all that traversal of rendering scene graph. That's an example of retained mode, because basically the retain is talking about what happens on the other side of the boundary. It's retaining all this structure, basically that you have. I shouldn't even say it that way. So I want to just slightly finish this, but we're going to talk about this in a lot more detail on future streams, so I won't belabor the point. The term retained mode and immediate mode are actually bad. I mean, I'll say that up front, because this retained part is actually not important. It's the API part that's important, and I will be showing you this in very explicit detail later on when we actually do some of these systems. But basically, the way to think about this is probably not to quite think about it the way I just said, unfortunately. The way to think about it is actually about lifetimes. Right? And I was trying to explain it the way that these things originally worked in renderers, which would have been true for the way I was saying it, but I'm not going to use them that way because it's kind of weak sauce. So we'll have to wait till we actually get there. But the right way to think about these things is actually lifetimes. So in immediate mode, the calling side is unaware of the lifetime of anything in the system. They just don't know, right? They are unaware of how long something exists. But in a retained mode, they are. So again, the example would be in that scene node architecture, or anything else really. You could even imagine, in fact, we could do a pretty good example with, say, OpenGL or Direct3D. If I have to create a texture binding, right? I have to say, I want to create a texture binding. Please give me a handle to a texture. And later on, I'll tell you when I need to release that texture. That's definitely retained mode, right? Because I have to mirror across the boundary this notion of this object's lifetime. The application that's calling Direct3D or OpenGL is aware of and manages the lifetime of that thing. And that's retained mode. Immediate mode are like, so those parts of like OpenGL and Direct3D are retained mode. Immediate mode is when I don't have to care. So for example, let's say I do something like in the old fixed function pipeline, where in OpenGL Direct3D, I would say, I want to set this blending mode. Right? I would say, here's what the blending mode is. Well, when I set that blending mode, I don't have to care how long that's true for, right? I just know that I set this blending mode and I do some operations, and the operations that are done will have that blending mode. Later on, someone else will change the blend mode to something when they want to do a different operation, but I don't have to actually undo that blend mode set. I don't have to like destroy the blend mode after I'm done with it or anything like this. I just say I need it and it's there, and later on someone else says they need something else and it's there. That's like immediate mode. These things have a lot of consequences. Your choices of which of those two things you pick at any point in any one of the layer boundaries is definitely going to be crucially important to how well the system functions, because there's tons of trade-offs that occur for each one of the decisions that you make. So we will be harping on this a lot. We'll be harping a lot on it here. We'll be harping a lot on it in here as well. And so that will get a little more detail. All right.
I'm going to be honest. All the stuff that he just went off on with immediate mode versus retained mode, I am gooey. I have no idea what the hell he was talking about. I'm looking forward to understanding what it was he was talking about once I get to that point in the series somewhere far down the line, if he hasn't scrubbed it all from the internet by then. But I guess somebody was asking, about my goals with all this. I think if I do have a concrete goal, it's not just to learn how to like build games and build a game engine. It would be pretty awesome to get to work professionally someday in the capacity of like a graphics programmer. That's kind of the pie in the sky. Like if I could go and do something really fun for me that I would get a lot of satisfaction doing, it'd be working on games as a graphics programmer. Now, I don't have that skill set. I've built a totally different skill set over the last 7 years. Now, if I had set out to be a graphics programmer 7 years ago, I might be a graphics programmer today and be like, you know what, this sucks. I want to go build websites for a living. But, it's having some place to go. It's having something to aim for that I've kind of missed, and I've just kind of been resting on the skills that I've built up to this point. Not that I don't still learn things from time to time, but to take on an entirely different challenge is it's just always something that's really appealed to me, because I feel like I'm improving myself when I do that, and I'm having something to work towards. When you have something to work towards, you're more motivated to do what it is that you do all the time. So anyways, that's kind of the very short version of that video I posted earlier. Bro, I grew up watching you. Congrats on all you've accomplished. I was in like first grade. Wow. Watching Minecraft and grew up with your content. Very proud of you. Thank you, Mason. I hope you're doing well.
I think we're out of time. I saw the timer pop up there. The timer, like I said, does not lie. So I believe we are now officially out of time. So I will finish, I will say that that is all we're going to talk about architecture-wise today. Hopefully you've got a reasonable idea of what I'm talking about now when I talk about architecture things. So really, the next thing that we have to talk about is sort of how we're going to structure these sorts of things. And that will again be something that we can actually start doing code. So tomorrow we should be able to actually start doing coding on these things because this is, like I said, I don't really like to do architecture at like a super high level pre-planning sort of thing. I like to sort of do it more organically like I do the rest of my code structuring. So that's okay. But I felt like it was important to kind of give this general overview of how we're thinking about things just so we can sort of have a little bit of opinion. So tomorrow I'll start off by redrawing this diagram basically in a little more detail of just how we're going to try to approach things. And then we'll sort of dive into doing code on this sort of stuff. All right, that brings us to question time. Please, if you could, keep your questions to things that we covered in today's stream or in previous streams. And put C Muratori in the question so that I can see it, because I've got a little thing that basically says.
So at this point, he does this pretty much every single video. Sometimes he goes over and keeps code, but he answers a bunch of questions from his chat that, you know, these questions were asked 10 years ago when he first originally streamed it. And I find it pretty interesting to listen to because he goes into more depth on certain things that maybe he just kind of glossed over during the main, really, because what I did with, oh, that damn Windows notification, I gotta shut that off. I'm looking forward to learning how to understand how to make games from scratch more and more, just because it's a lot of fun and I've got something to work towards. So, and that's not all that I'll probably talk about and do on this channel. There's probably a lot of things that I could offer my opinion on as far as the, you know, wider state of the software industry goes. I know one of the hottest topics of the last couple years has been that AI is going to replace all of us. And there's probably enough opinions on that topic, but I don't know. Anyway, thanks for tuning in, everybody. Hopefully the VOD isn't just an enormous mess because of all of those drops I've been having, but you should be able to find it on YouTube. I'm guessing on Twitch it'll be a bunch of different VODs that are all messed up. So I'll figure it out, and I'll just keep trying to improve the stream as we go forward here. I'm shaking off a lot of rust here, and it doesn't help that my internet is screwing me over.